"Officers eat first," someone whispered, barely louder than breath, as if the walls themselves might correct her if she was wrong, and yet that morning there were no officers at the long wooden table, only a line of metal trays, steam rising in slow curls, carrying a smell that did not belong to a prison camp, not to this place in Mississippi where the air hung thick as wet cloth and cicadas screamed like something alive beneath the heat. And still no one moved. The women stood in formation out of habit rather than command, gray uniforms clean but worn, hands steady at their sides, eyes fixed forward but not seeing, because what sat in front of them did not make sense, not after months of boiled potatoes, thin broth, measured portions that taught the body to expect less and the mind to trust nothing that looked generous. Liesl Hartmann stood third from the end, her posture exact, shoulders square, chin level, the way she had been trained in a hospital that no longer existed, her gaze not on the food but on the edges of things, the corners of the room, the exits, the distance between each soldier and the door, because survival had become a quiet arithmetic, and kindness, in her experience, was never part of the equation. The smell reached her anyway, rich and unfamiliar, something with meat, something with cream, something that carried memory without permission, and for a moment her breath changed, just slightly, before she corrected it, slower, controlled, invisible, across the room. Sergeant Daniel Brooks set the last pot down without ceremony, the metal touching wood with a dull, ordinary sound, no announcement, no order, no explanation, just a man placing food where food was meant to go, then stepping back as if the act required nothing more, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his face unreadable not from hardness but from the absence of performance. Like a man who had done this before and expected no reaction, the silence stretched, not tense but suspended, like something waiting to decide what it was going to become, and still no one reached for a spoon, because this was not how it worked, not in their world, not in any system they understood, where food was hierarchy and access was permission and permission was never given without cost. A younger nurse shifted her weight, just enough to make the bench creak beneath her, and the sound felt too loud, too exposed, as if it might trigger something unseen, but nothing happened, no shout, no correction. Only the slow drift of steam rising from the dish, thick and steady, touching faces that did not turn away. Liesl watched the soldier instead of the food, the way he stood with his weight slightly to one side, the way his hands rested at his hips without tension, the way his eyes moved once across the room and then away again, not counting them, not measuring them, not even waiting, and that was what unsettled her most, not the meal, not the smell, but the absence of expectation. She had learned to read men in seconds, to know who commanded, who punished, who pretended, but this one did none of those things. And the uncertainty pressed heavier than hunger. Somewhere behind her, the whisper came again, softer now, it must be for them, but there was no them, only the same empty space where authority should have been, and the food remained untouched, a quiet contradiction sitting in the center of the room, asking a question no one was ready to answer. The silence did not break all at once, it thinned, almost imperceptibly, like fog lifting from a field that had forgotten what sunlight felt like, and it was not a command that moved them, not a gesture, not even a glance, but something smaller, something quieter, the kind of shift that begins inside the body before the mind can argue against it. Sergeant Daniel Brooks reached for a tray without looking at anyone, his movements unhurried, unremarkable, as if he were alone in the room, as if the presence of 30 women standing rigid in uncertainty did not require acknowledgement, and that absence of performance made every motion feel heavier, more deliberate, more real. He picked up a spoon, dipped it into the thick, steaming mixture, and lifted it without hesitation, the metal catching the light for a fraction of a second before disappearing into the warmth, and then he ate, not cautiously, not to prove a point, but with the casual certainty of a man who trusted what was in front of him, chewing slowly, swallowing without ceremony, and then taking another bite as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Liesl Hartmann watched his throat as he swallowed, watched for the smallest sign of discomfort, the tightening of muscle, the hesitation of breath, anything that would confirm what she had been trained to expect, but there was nothing, only the steady rhythm of a man eating a meal he had eaten before, and that absence of danger did not comfort her, it unsettled her, because it left no place for suspicion to land. The younger nurse beside her shifted again, this time forward, her hand rising halfway before stopping, suspended in the air as if caught between two instructions that did not agree, and Liesel felt the movement without turning her head, felt the question forming without words, and still she did not move. Because movement meant decision, and decision meant risk. Across the table, another soldier sat down, then another, each taking a tray, each serving themselves in the same quiet manner, no urgency, no watchfulness, no sign that this was anything other than routine, and the room began to change, not in sound, not in structure, but in weight, the kind of invisible shift that alters how space is held between people. The steam continued to rise, slower now, softer, touching faces that had begun to turn despite themselves. And the smell grew stronger, not aggressive, not overwhelming, just present, patient, like something that did not need to insist on being noticed. Liesel lowered her eyes for the first time, not to the soldiers, not to the exits, but to the tray in front of her, the surface of the dish smooth and pale, streaked with darker lines of meat, the texture unfamiliar yet precise, nothing like the thin soup she had learned to distrust. And for a moment she did not think of danger or deception or rules, she thought of kitchens, of white tiles and clean instruments, of a time when food had purpose beyond survival. Her hand moved before she allowed it to, fingers closing around the spoon with a grip that was steady but not relaxed, and she paused there, not because she was afraid, but because she needed to understand what she was about to do, needed to locate the boundary she was crossing. No one stopped her, no one spoke, and that silence was different now, no longer heavy, no longer waiting, but open, as if the room itself had stepped back. She lifted the spoon, not high, not confidently, just enough to bring it closer, and then she did something she had not done in months. Something small and almost forgotten. She breathed in through her nose, slowly, deliberately, and the scent reached her fully for the first time, warm, layered, real, and her eyes closed for a fraction of a second, not in emotion, not yet, but in recognition, as if something long buried had just been acknowledged without permission. The spoon hovered just short of her lips, held there by something that was no longer fear and not yet trust. A thin line stretched between what she had learned and what she was seeing, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow around that single motion, the quiet weight of 30 decisions balanced on one small act. Liesel Hartmann did not look at the others, she did not look at the soldiers, she looked only at the food, at the surface that trembled slightly with the movement of her hand, and then she closed the distance. The first contact was not dramatic, not sudden, just warmth against her lips, then texture, then flavor, unfolding slowly in a way her body recognized before her mind allowed it, and she stopped, not pulling away, not continuing, simply holding the moment in place as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. It was rich, but not overwhelming, soft but not weak, something balanced and complete in a way she had not encountered since before the war, and the realization did not come as a thought, it came as a pause, a break in the pattern of survival that had defined every meal she had taken for months. She did not swallow immediately, not because she doubted it, but because she needed to understand it, needed to confirm that this was not an illusion her body had created out of memory, and when she finally did swallow, the motion was slow, deliberate, almost careful, as if she were handling something fragile that might not be offered again. Across from her, one of the younger nurses watched with open attention, not hiding it, not pretending indifference, and when Liesel lowered the spoon, just slightly, that was enough, the smallest signal, not permission, not instruction, just proof that nothing had happened except what had been expected, and the second woman reached forward, her hand less steady, her movement quicker, less measured, and the sound of metal against the tray, soft and ordinary, broke the last layer of stillness in the room. One by one, not in unison, not with any shared rhythm, the women began to move, each in her own time, each with her own hesitation, some faster, some slower, but all crossing the same invisible line that had held them in place, and the room shifted again, this time not in silence but in motion, small movements repeating, spoons lifting, trays sliding, breaths changing. Sergeant Brooks did not look up, did not acknowledge the change. He continued eating as he had before, steady, consistent, as if nothing of importance had occurred, and that was what allowed it to continue, what made the moment hold, because there was no reaction to react against, no confirmation, no correction, only the quiet acceptance of something that did not need to be explained. Liesel took another spoonful, this time without stopping, the motion smoother, less deliberate, and the taste did not diminish, did not reveal itself as a trick, it remained what it was, consistent, reliable, and that consistency was what unsettled her most, because it suggested intention, not accident, something chosen rather than allowed. She became aware of the others not through sound but through absence, the absence of tension, the absence of held breath, the absence of that rigid stillness that had defined them since their arrival, and in its place there was something quieter, something less visible but more profound, a gradual release of expectation, not fully, not completely, but enough to be felt. No one spoke, not in German, not in English, because there were no words that fit the moment, no language that could hold what was happening without reducing it, and so they did what they had not done in a long time. They ate without calculation, without counting, without preparing for what might come next, and that, more than the food itself, was the change that mattered. The rhythm settled into something almost ordinary, not loud, not careless, but steady, the quiet sound of spoons against metal, of breath returning to its natural pace, of bodies no longer braced for interruption, and yet beneath that surface there remained a layer of attention, not suspicion, but awareness, as if each woman was still measuring the moment, testing its edges to see if it would hold. Liesel Hartmann did not rush. She did not take more than she needed, each movement precise, each bite followed by a pause that was no longer hesitation but observation, the way she had once watched patients for signs of change, for shifts too small to name but too important to ignore, and what she saw now was not danger, not deception, but consistency, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply continues. Across the table, one of the soldiers reached for a piece of bread, tore it in half, and ate without looking up, crumbs falling unnoticed onto the tray, and the simplicity of that act carried a weight that no words could match, because it belonged to a world where food was not a transaction, not a tool, but something shared without calculation. The air in the room felt different now, still warm, still heavy with the Mississippi heat pressing through the walls, but no longer tight, no longer held in that rigid shape of expectation. Instead it moved, slow and quiet, like something that had been allowed to breathe again. One of the younger nurses let out a breath she had been holding for too long, the sound soft but distinct, and she did not apologize for it, did not correct herself, and no one turned, no one reacted, and that absence of reaction became its own kind of permission. Liesel noticed her hands next, not trembling, not gripping the spoon too tightly, but relaxed in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if they belonged to a different time, a different version of herself. And she adjusted her hold slightly, not because she needed to, but because she could, and that small freedom carried more meaning than the meal itself. Sergeant Brooks finished his tray and set the spoon down with a quiet, final sound, not abrupt, not signaling anything, just the natural end of an action, and he remained seated for a moment, not watching them, not waiting, simply present, and then he stood, lifted his tray, and walked toward the exit without looking back. No one followed him with their eyes. Not immediately, because the absence he left behind was not empty, it was full, filled with the space he had not occupied, the authority he had not used, the control he had not asserted. Liesel continued eating until her portion was gone, not hurried, not slowed, just complete, and when she placed the spoon down, she did not feel the usual calculation begin, did not prepare for the next instruction, the next condition, the next exchange. Instead there was a brief, unfamiliar stillness, not imposed, not required, simply there. She looked up then, not sharply, not searching, but calmly, and for the first time since entering the room, her eyes met those of another without flinching, without lowering, without that automatic retreat into distance, and the look held, not long, not intense, just long enough to confirm something that did not need to be spoken. Around her, trays were being cleared, movements quiet, uncoordinated, each woman returning to herself in her own way, but the difference remained, subtle but undeniable, not in what they did, but in how they did it. In the absence of that constant readiness for something to go wrong, the meal ended without announcement, without conclusion, no signal to mark its significance, and yet as they stood, as they moved back into formation out of habit rather than necessity, something had shifted beneath that habit, something that would not easily return to what it had been before, not because of what they had been given, but because of what had not been taken away. They returned to formation because that was what they had always done, bodies aligning without instruction, feet adjusting by inches until the lines were straight again, but the stillness that followed was not the same as before, not as rigid, not as tightly held, as if something inside the structure had loosened just enough to change its meaning. Liesel Hartmann stood where she had stood at the beginning, third from the end, shoulders square, hands at her sides, yet there was a difference she could not name in the way her weight settled, less forward, less prepared to react, more grounded in place rather than braced against it, and she noticed it the way she noticed everything now, not with alarm, but with quiet attention. Outside, the heat pressed against the building, heavy and constant, cicadas filling the air with a sound that never quite stopped, a reminder that the world continued beyond the walls of the camp, unchanged by what had just happened inside, and yet for the women in that room, the measure of things had shifted by something small and irreversible. One of the nurses glanced toward the door, not sharply, not checking for a guard, but simply looking, and when her eyes returned, they did not drop. Immediately, they held for a second longer than necessary, and that second carried weight, because it was not taken, it was given. No one spoke about the meal, not then, not as they waited for the next instruction, because there were no words that could be trusted yet. Language belonged to systems they no longer believed in, promises that had not held, explanations that had led nowhere, and so they remained silent. But it was not the silence of fear, it was the silence of something being considered, turned over, examined from different angles without being named. A guard stepped into the doorway, young, unfamiliar, his posture correct but not severe, and he gave a simple instruction to return to work assignments, his voice even, without emphasis, and the women moved as expected, turning in sequence, stepping forward in measured lines, but the movement itself carried a different quality, less mechanical, less driven by the need to avoid error, more like something remembered. Rather than enforced, Liesel walked with them, her pace steady, her gaze forward, but she found herself noticing details she would have ignored before, the way the light shifted across the wooden floor, the faint scent of food still lingering in the air, the sound of boots outside on packed dirt, each element separate, clear, not blurred together by the constant calculation of what might happen next. As they stepped out into the sunlight, the brightness did not feel like exposure, did not press against her the way it had in the first days. Instead it was simply there, wide and open, the sky stretching without interruption, the air thick but breathable, and she drew in a breath without measuring it, without preparing to hold it back. Beside her, the younger nurse who had hesitated earlier walked with a slightly different stride, not faster, not slower, just less constrained, as if the space around her had expanded by an inch or two, and that small change was visible only if one was looking for it, and Liesel was. The work awaited them, the same fields, the same tasks, the same routines that would fill the hours until evening. Nothing in that structure had changed, nothing in the rules had been rewritten, and yet as they moved toward it, something within the women had adjusted, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to alter how each step was taken. Liesel did not think of the meal as kindness, not yet, that word carried too much weight, too many conditions. Instead she thought of it as something simpler, something harder to dismiss, an action that had asked nothing in return, that had not been followed by instruction or consequence, and that absence remained with her as they walked, quiet but persistent. By the time they reached the edge of the field, the lines had formed again, tools distributed, tasks assigned, the day continuing exactly as it had the day before. But when Liesel bent to begin her work, her hands moved with the same precision and care, yet without that underlying tension that had once accompanied every motion, and for the first time since her capture, the work felt like work, not a test, not a condition, just something to be done, and that difference, small as it was, did not announce itself, it simply stayed. The field stretched wide under the noon sun, rows running long and straight, the earth dry at the surface but holding moisture beneath, the kind that clung to boots and tools if you worked it long enough, and the women moved into their places with the same quiet efficiency, bending, lifting, adjusting, the rhythm of labor returning as if it had never been interrupted, and yet something in that rhythm had changed, something subtle that did not slow them down but altered the weight of each motion. Liesel Hartmann knelt into her row, fingers finding the soil with practiced precision, her movements exact, economical, every action serving a purpose, but her breathing was different now, not measured in anticipation, not held between actions, but steady, consistent, the kind of breathing that belonged to a body no longer preparing for interruption. The sun pressed down, heavy and constant, heat rising from the ground in waves that blurred the edges of distance, and sweat formed at her temples, moved down along her jaw, but she did not wipe it away immediately. She let it fall, unnoticed, because her attention was not divided anymore, not split between the task and the question of what might come next. Beside her, the younger nurse worked with a similar focus, but there was a change there too, a slight adjustment in posture, less rigid through the shoulders, less tension in the way she gripped the tool, as if the body had released something it had been holding without realizing it. The sounds of the field carried in layers, the scrape of metal against earth, the distant call of a guard, the constant hum of insects that filled every open space, and within that sound there was no urgency, no sharp command cutting through, only the steady continuation of a day that did not need to assert itself. Liesel paused for a fraction of a second, not stopping her work but allowing her gaze to shift just enough to take in the line of women beside her, each one moving in her own rhythm, no longer perfectly synchronized, but not disordered either. Something in between, something more human than mechanical, and she returned to her task without marking the moment, because it did not require acknowledgement to exist. Time moved differently in the field, not counted in minutes but in repetitions, in the number of rows completed, in the angle of the sun as it shifted slowly across the sky, and as it moved, the memory of the meal did not fade, it did not dissolve into the background as she might have expected. Instead it remained, not as a distraction, not as something to return to, but as a quiet presence that altered how the present felt. At one point, a shadow passed briefly across her row, and she looked up just enough to see Sergeant Brooks walking along the edge of the field, not inspecting, not directing, simply moving from one point to another with the same unremarkable pace he had shown in the mess hall, and he did not stop, did not look down the lines, did not mark their work with approval or correction, and that absence of scrutiny carried its own kind of weight, because it suggested something that did not need to be enforced. Liesel lowered her gaze again, her hands continuing their steady motion, and she noticed that the tension that once accompanied the presence of a soldier was not there, not completely gone, but reduced, altered, no longer sharp, no longer immediate, and that change was not something she chose, it had happened without her permission, shaped by something she had not expected. The hours passed in that steady rhythm, the sun climbing, then beginning its slow descent, the heat shifting from sharp to dull, and when the call came to pause, it did not break anything, it simply marked a transition, the end of one sequence and the beginning of another. And as Liesel straightened, her back adjusting to the change, she did not feel the same weight settle over her shoulders, the same anticipation of what might follow. Instead there was a brief, quiet neutrality, a space where expectation had not yet filled in. She wiped her hands against the fabric of her uniform, the motion simple, habitual, and as she stood among the others, waiting for the next instruction, she realized something without forming it into words, something that did not announce itself but remained steady and clear beneath the surface of thought, that the difference between this day and the ones before it was not in what they had done, but in what they had not needed to prepare for, and that absence, small and almost invisible, had begun to change everything. The pause in the field did not feel like an interruption, it felt like a continuation, a shift from one kind of movement to another, and the women stood in loose lines, no longer perfectly aligned, no longer held in that rigid symmetry that had once defined every moment, and yet there was no disorder, only a quiet adjustment, as if something invisible had loosened its grip. Liesel Hartmann remained where she was, her hands resting at her sides, the faint trace of soil still beneath her fingernails, her breathing steady, her gaze level, and for the first time since arriving at the camp, she did not immediately search for the next instruction, did not calculate distance or timing or consequence. She simply stood. The sun had begun its descent, the light softer now, stretching shadows across the rows, turning the field into something less harsh, less defined, and the air, though still warm, had lost its edge, no longer pressing against the skin with the same insistence, and in that softened light, the details became clearer, the texture of the ground, the subtle movement of grass at the edges, the quiet shift of weight from one foot to another among the women. A canteen was passed down the line, not thrown, not ordered, simply handed from one person to the next, and when it reached Liesel, she took it without hesitation, the metal warm from the sun, the water inside not cold but real, and she drank, not quickly, not as if it might be taken away, but steadily, allowing herself the time to finish before passing it on. No one counted the seconds, no one watched her hands, and that absence of scrutiny remained unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, but noticeable, like a space that had always been filled now left open. a voice called from the far side of the field, not sharp, not commanding, just a signal that the break would end soon, and the women responded with small adjustments. Shoulders straightening, tools being lifted again, but the transition lacked the sudden tightening that had once accompanied every instruction. Instead it unfolded gradually, as if each person was choosing to return rather than being pushed. Liesel bent again to her row, her movements resuming with the same precision, but the rhythm had changed, not in speed, not in efficiency, but in weight. Each action carried less resistance, less of that underlying tension that had once shaped every gesture, and she noticed it not as a difference but as an absence, something no longer there. Across the field, Sergeant Brooks moved again, this time closer, stopping briefly near one of the rows where a tool had been set down incorrectly, and he adjusted it without comment, placing it in the correct position before stepping away. No reprimand, no instruction, just a correction made as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and the woman whose tool it had been did not flinch, did not lower her gaze. She simply picked it up and continued. Liesel observed this without turning her head fully, her attention divided but not strained, and she understood something in that moment, not as a conclusion, not as a belief, but as a quiet recognition, that the absence of harshness was not accidental, not temporary, but consistent, and that consistency was beginning to replace something older, something deeper that had once defined every expectation. The work continued until the light shifted again, until the shadows grew longer and the air cooled just enough to be noticed, and when the final call came, it did not break the rhythm, it completed it, marking the end of the day not with urgency but with a kind of quiet finality. As they stood once more, tools set aside, lines forming again out of habit, Liesel felt the same stillness return, but it was no longer empty, no longer filled with anticipation of what might follow. Instead it held something steadier, something that did not demand attention but remained present, and as she looked ahead, not searching, not measuring, she realized that the day had passed without a single moment requiring her to brace for what might come next, and that realization, simple as it was, did not fade as they began to walk back. It stayed with her, quiet and unspoken, altering the space around every step. The walk back from the field unfolded without urgency, a slow line of figures moving across the open ground, boots pressing into the dirt with a steady rhythm that no longer felt like something imposed, and the sky above them had softened into a wide stretch of fading light, the sun low enough to cast long shadows that moved beside them like quiet companions rather than warnings. Liesel Hartmann walked within that line, her posture unchanged in form but altered in feeling, the precision still there, the discipline intact, yet no longer carrying the same internal resistance, and she noticed the difference not as a thought but as a lack of friction, as if something that had once pressed against every movement had simply stepped aside. The camp came into view gradually, wooden structures outlined against the horizon, fences stretching in measured lines, guard towers still and present. Nothing about the physical place had changed, nothing in its structure suggested anything new, and yet the approach to it did not tighten her chest the way it had before. Did not trigger that automatic preparation for what might happen once inside. Beside her, the younger nurse walked in step, not perfectly aligned but close enough, and at one point their arms moved within inches of each other without either pulling away, without that reflexive need to maintain distance, and the closeness passed without acknowledgement, unnoticed except in the way it did not create tension. Voices carried faintly from another section of the camp, distant, indistinct, part of the background rather than a signal to interpret, and the evening air held a different quality, cooler by degrees, moving across skin in a way that could be felt rather than endured. As they reached the gate, the guard standing there did not raise his voice, did not hurry them, he simply stepped aside after a brief count, his attention measured but not intrusive, and the line continued forward without pause. The transition from open field to enclosed space happening without that sharp internal shift that had once marked every crossing of a boundary. Inside the compound, the ground changed underfoot, harder, more worn, but even that difference did not carry the same weight. It was simply a change in surface, not a signal of control, and Liesel found herself noticing the small details again, the pattern of footsteps worn into the dirt, the way the light settled against the walls, the quiet movement of others returning from different assignments. The barracks door stood open, the interior dim but visible, and as they stepped inside, the air shifted again, cooler, still, carrying the faint scent of wood and fabric. And the transition did not compress her, did not close in around her, it simply enclosed the space, leaving her awareness unchanged. The women moved to their places without instruction, routines guiding them where orders were not needed, and yet the movement lacked that rigid precision. It allowed for small variations, for the natural pace of each person rather than a forced uniformity, and those variations did not draw attention, they were simply accepted. Liesel sat on her bunk, hands resting loosely in her lap, and for a moment she did not prepare for the next sequence, did not anticipate inspection or correction or demand. She simply sat, her breathing steady, her gaze unfixed, and the stillness that settled around her was not empty, it was full of something quiet and stable. The memory of the meal returned then, not vividly, not in detail, but as a presence, a point of reference that did not fade as the day moved on, and she did not question it, did not try to explain it. She allowed it to remain as it was, something that had happened without condition, something that had not required response. Around her, the others settled in similar silence, movement soft, uncoordinated, each person returning to herself in a way that did not need to be synchronized, and no one spoke of what had changed, because nothing visible had changed. The camp remained the same, the rules remained the same, the structure held as it always had, and yet within that structure, something had shifted, something that did not announce itself but stayed, quiet and persistent, altering the way the space was felt. As the light outside continued to fade, and the room dimmed with it, Liesel leaned back slightly, her shoulders no longer held forward, no longer braced, and she realized, not as a conclusion but as a simple awareness, that for the first time since her capture, the end of the day did not feel like the closing of something endured, but like the natural completion of something lived, and that difference, small and unspoken, remained with her as the room settled into silence. The barrack settled into a deeper quiet as the last of the light slipped away, not suddenly but in slow degrees, shadows lengthening until they became the room itself, and the sounds that remained were small and distant, the shift of fabric, the quiet exhale of breath, the faint hum of the world outside continuing without interruption. Liesel Hartmann lay back against the thin mattress, her hands resting loosely at her sides, not folded, not held in place, simply there, and the position felt unfamiliar not because of the surface beneath her but because of the absence of tension within it, as if her body had forgotten, for a moment, the need to remain ready. The ceiling above her was plain, wooden beams crossing in straight lines, nothing hidden, nothing altered, and she traced those lines with her eyes without purpose, not searching for weakness or escape, just observing them as they were. Around her, the other women moved into rest in their own ways, some sitting longer, some lying down immediately, but none with the same rigid precision that had once defined every action, and that difference did not draw attention, it simply existed, quiet and unspoken. The memory of the day did not return in sequence, did not replay in detail, instead it remained in fragments, the weight of the spoon, the warmth of the food, the absence of command, each piece separate yet connected by something she could not name, something that did not need explanation to remain real. She closed her eyes briefly, not to sleep, not yet, but to feel the stillness without the distraction of sight, and what she noticed was not the room, not the others, but herself, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the lack of interruption, the absence of that constant internal question that had once followed every moment: what comes next, what will be taken, what must be given. It was not gone entirely, that question, but it had moved, shifted from the front of her mind to somewhere quieter, less urgent, and in its place there was space, small but present, a space where nothing immediate needed to be decided. Outside, a door closed somewhere in the distance, the sound carrying softly through the structure, and it did not trigger anything in her, did not cause her body to tighten or her breath to pause. It was simply a sound, no more, no less. She opened her eyes again, the darkness now more complete, outlines reduced to suggestion rather than form, and in that reduced space, she found that her awareness did not narrow, it remained steady, unchanged, as if it no longer depended on constant input to remain alert. The day had not changed the camp, had not altered the rules or the structure or the roles they all occupied, nothing visible had shifted in a way that could be pointed to or measured, and yet the absence of what had not happened carried more weight than any action could have. No raised voices, no correction, no demand for gratitude, no condition attached to what had been given. Liesel turned slightly onto her side, the movement slow, unguarded, and she allowed herself to settle fully into the mattress, not holding back, not bracing against the surface as if it might be taken away, and that simple act, so small it would have gone unnoticed before, now carried meaning, not because it changed anything around her, but because it changed something within her. She did not think of trust, that word was too large, too final. Instead she understood something quieter, something more precise, that not everything required resistance, that not every moment carried a hidden cost, and that understanding did not arrive as a decision, it arrived as a state, something she found herself in rather than something she chose. The room remained silent, the night continuing without interruption, and as her breathing slowed, as the distance between each thought grew longer, she realized that the most significant part of the day was not what had been given to them, not the meal, not the gesture, but what had been removed, the expectation of cruelty, the certainty of it. And in its place there was something else, not hope, not yet, but the absence of certainty, and that absence, quiet and steady, was enough to change the shape of everything that followed.